changes. We need leaders who reduce government spending, remove government barriers to work, embrace free trade, cut taxes, provide school choice. There's no more picking winners and losers. Let's lift up all Americans. Hello, welcome to this week's Economy. This is episode 72. Thank you for joining me again today. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I'm president of Ginn Economic Consulting, affiliate at more than 15 think tanks across the country, and former chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget in the Trump White House. So I'm bringing all this together to try to give you some more insights about what's happening in the news today. But let's jump right to it. So number one, the Fed leaves the target rate unchanged. The news, the Federal Reserve, America's central bank, left its federal funds target rate unchanged at 5.25 to 5.5%, where it has been since July 2023, so a year now. My take? Unfortunately, no change in its statement and more aggressively cutting its bloated balance sheet of $7.2 trillion, which is the source of persistently elevated inflation. We've got to do something about this sooner rather than later. While inflation has been moderating recently, in fact, the Fed's preferred inflation measure, which is the personal consumption expenditures that excludes food and energy, what they call the core PCE, remained at 2.6% year over year. In June, it was up 0.2% for the month, which is well above the Fed's average inflation rate target of 2%, which indicates to me that if it's an average inflation, we've been above 2% for years now. It's got to come below 2% at some point. And that's going to happen when they start to cut their balance sheet. This indicates also that there will likely be a no target rate cut in September. They put this on the table, where Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said this could happen in September. The betting markets are indicating that it will happen in September. But I'm hesitant to think that that's going to be the case, given that inflation remains high, given that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet remains so high as well. Look, I really think the simple solution here, and there's no simple solution, there's all trade-offs, is to cut the Fed's balance sheet substantially. It's about 25% of GDP today. It should be closer to 6% of GDP, where it was before the great financial crisis in 2008. We never got back to that level, and we really should. That means that the Federal Reserve's balance sheet should be about $2 trillion today instead of $7.2 trillion. So you understand why we're losing our purchasing power. There's a lot of asset bubbles with the stock market, the housing market, and so much more. And a lot of these are going to start to deflate quickly, which is bound to happen. I mean, it's unaffordable in a lot of cases. And so this is going to happen sooner rather than later, unfortunately. And it's all the doing by the Federal Reserve. Congress is overspending, running deficits, and the Federal Reserve overprinting money. These are government failures that continue, and it won't end until they stop doing what they're doing. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to end the Fed. I don't see that happening anytime soon. So we need strict rules, particularly on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. And I think that's a great way forward. Number two, Milton Friedman would have turned 112 on his birthday on July 31st. Milton Friedman is my favorite economist, okay? So my take is, he passed in 2006. So he didn't see the school choice revolution that he really got started, the state flat tax revolution that he talked a lot about, and sustainable budget revolution that he was instrumental in for so long. But his work ignited these revolutions and much more. You can check out my commentary that I wrote back in 2012, actually, for PolicyMike.com that I'm going to put in the show notes page. But I mean, this is extraordinary. I really think we need to get more insights from Milton Friedman because he brought so much to the table at the end of the day. Number three for you is overspending in Texas. The news: the Texas Legislative Budget Board recently released the fiscal size up for the current 2-year budget for 24-25. Okay, so my take is the Texas legislature passed the largest budget increase in Texas history, with increases of 21.2% in general revenue funds that they have the most control over, 32% increase in state funds, which includes general revenue dedicated funds, and other funds, and 21.5% increase in all funds, the total budget, when you include state funds and all funds, when you appropriately compare initial appropriations of 22-23 to initial appropriations in 24-25. This resulted in the second largest new property tax relief of $12.7 billion, and still property taxes increased by $165 million last year. Other things that were going on out of this report is the Texas legislature increased its share of spending on public education to about 50% from historic increases in spending on government schools by 33.3% in state funds and by 28.6% in all funds. Substantial increases for government schools or public education, whatever you want to call it. Just substantial increases overall. Even though some say that we're not spending a lot on education in Texas, that's just not the case. And, even if you include some of the funding from COVID-related funding in 22-23, it might slightly change these numbers, but not by a lot, because there's still some of that funding that remained persistent going into 24-25 as well. So here are some details, though, and budget recommendations that you should know as listeners of this and all the work that I do. And this goes across the board with all states, but let me focus on what's happening in Texas. So this fiscal size up budget document provides budget information across different articles and for each funding source from 1 2-year budget period to the next. While this information is important, comparing what was budgeted or expended in the prior period in fiscal year 22-23 to what was appropriated in the current period, fiscal year 24-25, is inconsistent, like comparing apples to oranges. The reason is that the budget expended amounts in 22-23 include initial appropriations, supplemental appropriations, and other budget changes, while the appropriation amounts in 24-25 include only initial appropriations. So you can see I'm going here, but what I've tried to do is provide a consistent comparison from the Legislative Budget Board's fiscal size up for the 22-23 book and their 24-25 book to get the results in the first chart that I'm going to provide in the show notes, while the second chart is what the LBB reports. What you'll notice is that the increase in all funds, so the total budget, which come from all sources, is 21.5% when consistently calculating from initial appropriations to initial appropriations. At the same time, the LBB reports to be just a 2.7% increase. This is why it's an inconsistent comparison that doesn't really tell us very much about what's happening to taxpayer dollars in Texas. This is because the 2024-25 amounts don't include supplemental appropriations or other spending that will happen by the Texas legislature. It does every time, so it is incomplete and incorrect to compare the two amounts in the fiscal size up without this context. And other news about this report, though, is public education funding soared in state funds and all funds. Some of this funding includes the $12.7 billion in new property tax relief, which was the second largest amount in Texas history, and $5.3 billion to maintain past property tax relief efforts. This does represent a larger share of public education funded by the state, up to about 50%. Spending on government schools continues to ratchet up rapidly even as student outcomes decline for most subjects and across most grades. And teacher pay stagnates as the funding goes to facilities, athletics, and administration instead. Before any more funding happens for public education, there should be consideration of these factors, and more than likely, there will be less spending next session because of the recent rapid increases and poor outcomes outlined above. Finally, school choice funding for universal CAs must pass next year without holding public education harmless because parents choose alternatives, which proves that government schools can't compete. The Texas legislature should also reform the school finance system, which was fully funded per the LBB's fiscal size up, to eliminate the current formulas and replace them with just ESAs that can reduce total expenditures and use the reductions to cut school district property taxes, as they are on a path to elimination and the state to fund 100% of schooling, as the Texas Constitution states in Article 7 with ESAs. So this fiscal size up, what it does is it hides the real excessive spending in Texas. While the Texas legislature has done a relatively good job spending over the last year, compared with the key rates of population growth plus inflation, and really that should be the last decade, not the last year, this excess in current budget is unsustainable. It should be addressed in the next session with budget cuts. The governor should call for 10% cuts across the board to address the excessive spending and better prioritize taxpayer money for limited roles of government and substantial tax relief, preferably by reducing school district property tax rates and the business margin tax rates now and in each session until they are zero. So there's a lot of work to do overall, even in the great state of Texas. Number 4 in the news here, government stockpile Bitcoin. The news, there are reports that the federal and state governments may start stockpiling or adding Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to their portfolios in public pensions and rainy day funds. My take is that I should first note, right, that I prefer governments to not get involved in Bitcoin and other currencies or cryptocurrencies to avoid propping up or devaluing them, as governments should be involved less, if at all, in these and in other markets. However, cryptos could be a part of the portfolios of the federal government, federal, state, and local retirement plans, overall, or in rainy day state funds. So there is a path to doing something with those, just not too much. I wonder how much, though, that the governments should use taxpayer money to do these things and redistribute money from the productive private sector to these government activities. Moreover, governments shouldn't be stockpiling assets, but could use cryptocurrencies to diversify portfolios. For example, there's no reason Texas should have an annualized cap of 20% on certain tax revenue on its rainy day fund, which brings it to $27 billion in its rainy day fund. Texas could soon have $23 billion in that fund, so almost reaching the cap of $27 billion. That's too much money sitting on the sidelines in the hands of government when unforeseen tax revenue shortfalls should be covered by spending less during recessions or disasters. The bottom line is that governments across America are spending unsustainably and don't have quote unquote extra funds, so they should be very cautious with taxpayer money to get into trying to hold any assets such as Bitcoin or other assets. Number 5, the new right is old progressivism. The news, as Politico reports, the think tank American Compass is trying to gain a foothold in the GOP by seeing an opening with Senator J.D. Vance as Trump's pick for VP. This think tank sees itself as part of the new right, which opposes tax cuts, deregulation, and free trade. It claims these policies have been a disastrous economic policy. My take is the Biden administration left a dire economic situation and still ongoing. Americans face high inflation, historically low savings rate. A fix will not come from more or bigger government like the quote unquote new right or the national conservatives or even the Democrat support. We need less government that unleashes economic potential for people to flourish. All Americans. We need leaders who reduce government spending, remove government barriers to work, embrace free trade, cut taxes, provide school choice. There's no more picking winners and losers. Let's lift up all Americans. Number 6, Harris's platform hurts Americans. The news, as Kamala Harris rises as the likely presidential nominee for the Democrat Party, her platform is beginning to take shape. Predictions such as Harris's FTC antitrust policy, her tax policy, and the future financial regulations are hitting the news. My take is America's federal antitrust laws have been based on the consumer welfare standard for more than a half a century. But Harris, Lena Khan, even Senator J.D. Vance and others across the political spectrum want to change that, hurting consumers and producers. This would double down on the Biden administration's onslaught on competition through flawed antitrust efforts. This is especially true for, quote, the big tech companies that generate substantial consumer welfare and billions of dollars in economic activity. It's good to see Harris continue to promise not to raise taxes on those making less than $400 per year, but that's unlikely if the 2017 Trump tax cuts expire, as she has promised. These tax cuts should be improved and made permanent by stopping picking winners and losing the tax code, which Trump and Vance have advocated for to some capacity. Harris will likely continue the Biden administration's legacy of increased regulation and flawed ESG and DEI policies through the FDIC, the CFPB, and other banking industry regulators. Increasing transparency, reducing political interference, and providing regulatory relief for banks will enhance competition and improve banking services and affordability instead of trying to achieve harmful objective based on likely good intentions. So a lot of news going on. I hope you're able to take all that in. My media hits and events. I've been publishing pieces, giving quotes, and completed interviews this week at the Lars Larson Show, the Fox Business with Neil Cavuto Show, NTD News, AIER, American Institute for Economic Research, Kansas Policy Institute, and many more. Please don't miss those. I'll still leave those in the show notes page as well. Regarding the Let People Prosper show, don't miss episode 107, the Let People Prosper show with Doug Carswell this past Monday. We had a great conversation about his time in British Parliament and now his work in Mississippi. Tuesday's episode of the Let People Prosper show digs into how removing government obstacles in the healthcare system can improve patient care with Dr. Dean Waldman, who is author of Curing the Cancer in the United States Healthcare and many other books as well. The quote of the week is by Milton Friedman, the birthday boy, quote, inflation is taxation without legislation. Exactly right. We can't forget that. The Bible verse of the week is Acts 20:24, quote, however, I consider my life worth nothing to me. My only aim is to finish the race and complete the task the Lord Jesus has given me, the task of testifying to the good news of God's grace. Amen. So in conclusion, thanks for joining me in episode 72 of this week's Economy. For more insights, visit vanceginn.com and get a paid subscription to my Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com so you receive these insights directly in your inbox. God bless you, and until next time, let people prosper.